think our conversation is going to be so beneficial for journalists because your research is about the psychological effects of covering traumatic events. So thank you for coming on and sharing your expertise. I really appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity. I think, I don't think a lot of journalists realize the impact that their work can have on them. And I'm really welcoming the opportunity to try to share that and get the word out.
Yeah, so before we get into all of that, because we'll have so much to dive into, how did you first get your start in this?
Yeah, so I started off as a local television news reporter. I did that for about 10 years. And I did a lot of stories on the police beat. And I think I enjoyed it. I mean, I liked being the lead of the newscast a lot, but I also thought that they were challenging stories that I enjoyed being able to do well. So I think it was just something that I could do well. But as I went on and the number of years that I was covering those types of stories, I did start to sort of notice that I just sort of wasn't feeling great about it. You know, I'd kind of leave those stories kind of feeling, really down. And I just sort of always felt like I was the only one, in the newsroom, like nobody else seems to be having this problem. So after I had been reporting, I really wanted to get into academia because I was looking to kind of change careers and I really enjoyed working with interns. So I was like, maybe I should teach because I really like coaching these students that we get. And so that's kind of how I decided to move into academia after reporting. And so I went back and got my master's and then decided in the course of that to get a PhD. And I was looking for topics and things. And this idea of being affected by the work that I did kind of popped back up as a possible thing that I could start looking into. And it, sort of blossomed from there. There was a few tiny little studies that I found that were starting to talk about this idea of psychological trauma with reporters. And I thought, here it is, there's not a lot of people doing this. I've had personal experience with this. I want to know more. I want to understand. And it kind of really blossomed from there.
Did you deal with the stress as a journalist yourself? And did you know it at the time or did you notice it after the fact?
I really did. I was on the police beat and I covered a lot of crime and murders and, assaults and all the range of things. And I enjoyed doing it because I felt like it was important work and I felt like I could tell those stories well. But at the same time, I did feel it. And I was not in a newsroom where I felt like I could say something about that. Or I didn't really think that is what journalists talked about, right?
Yeah.
And I had plenty of really close friends from that newsroom, people I'm still, in touch with. So I think if I had known that it would be something I should mention, I could have gone to them and we would have talked it out. But at the time, I just didn't think as a young journalist that was what you did. You didn't talk about these things affecting you, but they did. And the more that I had to do them and the more that there wasn't a break from them, the more it just kind of weighed on me. And I was feeling that fatigue and feeling that sort of emotional drain that I could never really kick. And I just didn't know that was normal and that it was a normal human emotional reaction to the stuff that I was covering.
Yeah.
And that there were lots of ways that I could cope with that. And I just didn't know. So I sort of felt the weight of that for sure. And it was, it's kind of it's again sort of a shame because I enjoyed those stories because I knew that they were important. But at the same time, I was starting to just feel really bad covering them just because of the emotional toll that it was taking and that drain that I never seemed to be able to kind of fix.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what is your PhD specifically in now?
It's technically in what's called media effects, that's just because that was the program that I was a part of. But I studied the psychological effects of covering news on news workers. So I looked at post-traumatic stress and something called compassion fatigue, which is a form of secondary traumatic stress, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yes.
And I looked at that in television news workers. So I interviewed and surveyed hundreds of television news workers and measured them for symptoms of these different things and kind of compared that to their exposure to different types of stories. And that was, kind of the impetus of the study. And I did find things. And I think it was interesting because, even the folks in my program, my PhD program, they were like, okay, yeah, whatever, that's an interesting topic, but once I found all this data and I presented it to them, and they were really kind of fascinated as well by the fact that I had found these connections between what people had been covering and some of these psychological symptoms. So even they were like, what are you talking about? But then when presented with that data, they were kind of as fascinated as I was. So,
Yeah.
kind of just gone from there on it.
Well, I'm so excited to talk about all of this. So, when we say trauma in journalism, what does that exactly mean?
Yeah, so it kind of has, when we have this conversation about journalism and trauma, the trauma part kind of has like two sides to it. So when we talk about trauma, we first have to talk about sort of traumatic stories that can be potentially traumatic to that journalist who's covering them. So anything that is going to cause sort of a bit of mental anguish. And, for example, things like your police beat, your mass shootings, your accidents, anything where a reporter is in the mix of or exposed to human suffering in some way or another, or to some level or another. So those are potentially traumatic stories. But then the other sort of side of that is we have to look at trauma from a situation of trauma experienced by the journalists. So what are the mental and emotional and psychological effects that come from having been exposed to all of that? So in what
Yes.
way is the journalist experiencing symptoms of their own trauma because they've been exposed to these types of stories? So it's got sort of that, two-sided definition when we're talking specifically about journalists and the trauma associated with their work.
For sure. So when we talk about the former, what kind of assignments or beats do you feel carry the highest exposure of trauma?
Sure, you can, it's important to know that trauma is relative. So I may say this type of assignment could be potentially traumatic, and someone may cover that and have covered something like that and be like, really? I don't have any problem
True.
with that,
Yeah.
So there's a lot that goes into how someone may react to a potentially traumatic incident, but typically the ones that we see associated with trauma symptoms are things like your police beat, talking to victims, fires, car accidents, major disasters, mass shootings. There's been a lot of research on war, but that seems to be something that I guess people are more willing to accept. Like, oh yeah, if a journalist goes to war, yeah, they're gonna be traumatized. That's a war, right? But what
Right.
people don't realize is that the regular things, the sort of daily news that local journalists can be exposed to, have the same potential to cause traumatic symptoms.
Yeah.
So again, it's kind of relative, but those are the ones that are typical. Any of those kind of bread and butter stories of the daily news grind that are going to expose a journalist to someone else who has been harmed in some way.
Do you find that trauma in journalism is usually more about a singular event or exposure over a larger time frame?
It can actually be both. So you can have a singular incident, a singular story that causes you to have traumatic stress symptoms just from that one incident. And again, it's kind of relative, but something that whatever you were seeing, what you were hearing, and what you were exposed to was so bad that it caused, just that one incident was enough to cause you to develop some traumatic stress symptoms. However, it's also that cumulative effect is also a possibility. So you can, over time, hearing victims, interviewing victims, seeing people at their worst, testimony in court cases, and going to fires, watching people lose everything, car accidents, even getting to that scene before that scene has, before the paramedics have had a chance to take victims, and seeing folks like that being worked on over and over and over again also has the potential to cause some traumatic stress symptoms. So how those look may be a little bit different, and how strong they are, and the effects of those may be different, but both can cause it. It can be that one incident, and there's plenty of sort of testimonials from journalists who will say it was this one thing that did it, but there are far more that it is the accumulative exposure to things like this that eventually lead to those symptoms.
Yes. So in doing your research, what what are some of the things that you did find out?
So there's kind of in a nutshell of the things that I've found that there are far more reporters, journalists out there who have symptoms of traumatic stress than they realize. So between interviewing and also doing surveys, I've discovered that there are a lot of traumatic symptoms being experienced, and they may not rise to the level of something like a post-traumatic stress. You know, we hear of PTSD. That's a big deal. That is a life-altering diagnosis.
Yeah, and stopping
And
you there, some
Mhm.
journalists avoid wanting to use the term PTSD because they feel like they can't use that specific term when they're talking about what they're going through.
Correct. And there are journalists who have it. There are journalists who have been exposed to things that are so traumatic that they are absolutely is suffering from diagnosable PTSD. But there are far more that have symptoms of it that are associated with it, but may not rise to the level of that sort of big diagnosis. That doesn't mean that those symptoms aren't awful and aren't life altering and aren't causing you a problem. It may just not be that diagnosable level. So I think that, yeah, maybe people are reluctant to throw around PTSD, and the chances are is that they probably don't maybe have that, but they do have what's called secondary traumatic stress or another form of that, which is a lot of PTSD symptoms, just not to that level. And things like depression are also fairly common, and journalists just don't realize that the reason these things are happening to them is the work. They're looking elsewhere. I am depressed for personal life reasons or other things, or I am burnt out because I don't like my boss, or it's the grind, it's too many hours. When in reality, it is the exposure to these traumatic moments over time that is causing these symptoms, most of the time. So there's a lot of journalists just simply not realizing that this is what's happening to them. But if you
Yeah.
look at my research and other research, 100% of journalists, when they are surveyed, say that they have covered at least one thing in their career that could be considered traumatic, usually more. And 90% of them experience that event in the first year of their time on the job as a journalist. So you can't escape it. You're going to get exposed to it. And the more journalists can kind of start to understand that having traumatic reactions to that is possible, the better off that we can be in terms of trying to build resilience and being able to come back from things like that.
You made a great point because not only could it be a traumatic story, but you could also be in a newsroom that doesn't feel safe, or you could be in a situation being in the public eye that doesn't feel safe. There's so many other ways in which we can experience trauma that might not have to do with even a story itself.
Absolutely. And especially recently with the sort of turn, I guess, turn against the press, or sort of that, demonizing of the press and
Mistrust.
the distrust of the press, that is adding a layer of problem in this regard. Because one of the things that I've found repeatedly is that a journalist's belief in their mission, a journalist's belief that what they are doing matters and is important, is incredibly important in terms of resilience to trauma. So a journalist, for example, I did a couple of studies with people who covered Hurricane Harvey, which was a big deal a couple of years ago, and they were immersed in that for a very long time. And what kept them going and what helped them sort of bounce back was this idea that they were providing a very valuable service to the people of that community, keeping them informed, letting the world know the devastation that was happening, within these little pockets of impact for Harvey, and that kept them going. But when you have this sort of blowback, this backlash against the press, that ability to fall back on that mission kind of goes away, because now it's harder to say to myself, but I'm doing something good here. People are appreciating my work. People see the value in me being here and telling the story. When you don't have that, that takes away a very powerful barrier to traumatic stress that journalists have. And so yeah, just while the blowback and the sort of distrust of the press may not necessarily be causing the trauma, it is kind of chipping away at a very powerful mechanism for resilience in journalists, and that's a problem.
Yeah, and also, as this job is all consuming news, you wake up and you look at your phone and you see what's going on. And even for a person that's not a journalist, that can be triggering mentally. But now, as a journalist, we're covering it 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 hours a day.
Yeah, absolutely. And the very I guess way that journalism works, that 24/7 version of it only serves to kind of contribute to opening up someone to start to suffer from traumatic stress reactions, because you can't get away from it. So the ability to disconnect and shut it off and kind of set it aside is a very powerful coping mechanism, and is a good one to be able to do. I go home, I leave the news at work, and I go do my thing, and then I go back to the news when I go back to work. There's very few journalists in that can do that. News is news. Working in news can be all consuming, and it is hard to disconnect. So that, just the business of news makes it hard to be able to cope in the healthy ways that you're supposed to. Also, getting sort of breaks from certain assignments can be difficult. Not only does a journalist not want to be taken off of a big unfolding story, but that newsroom may also not have enough people to be able to rotate journalists on and off of big stories that are unfolding over the course of days or weeks. So again, being able to sort of get out of that situation for a little while can be very, very helpful. But what newsroom these days can afford to pull a journalist from an unfolding story, and what journalist is going to want to say yes to that, even if they know they need it?
Yeah, and I've recently heard the term around social media secondhand trauma or secondhand post-traumatic stress disorder. Can you talk about what that is and how maybe we are indirectly being affected, not even as journalists, but as human beings?
Yes, while there isn't a secondary PTSD, because again, that's a very very specific type of mental and emotional and psychological injury that occurs under very specific situations. However, like I said before, you can have symptoms that are similar to that, and that is the secondary traumatic stress. So where post-traumatic stress is where you yourself feel that you are in harm's way. You felt your life was threatened. That's kind of a hallmark to PTSD. Or you actually saw someone being killed, or you saw someone that had just been killed. It has to, there's sort of a high bar there to officially kind of go down that PTSD road. However, hearing about it or seeing the aftermath of it, repeated exposure to it, that's where you get what's called vicarious or secondary traumatic stress. So the same thing, like you mentioned, can happen to viewers and people who are scrolling, social media. Take, for example, the Charlie Kirk shooting. That video was online, unedited, boom, ready for people to see. And all you had to do was scroll Twitter and there it was, or X, sorry, scroll X and there it was. That repeated viewing of that type of thing, just from a viewer standpoint, can cause traumatic stress symptoms. And just as much as a journalist would kind of get the same thing. So yes, exposure
and I was
to
working, and I was working when that news broke, and we saw the videos pop up, and we have to look at the videos as journalists, and that can be really taxing on a person.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of studies, I haven't done them, but there are a lot of studies that are with video editors back in the newsroom, the producers, folks in master control, the people that have to see the stuff coming in and then edit it. Those folks absolutely have symptoms of vicarious and secondary trauma, just because they're seeing it even on the screens. They're not there, but even on the screens, and having to edit it and scroll and, be exposed to it over and over again. And here, give me a 30-second VO. No, wait, now I need a package. No, wait, it's a VOSAT. Re-edit. That exposure can absolutely lead to secondary traumatic stress.
Do you find that as we evolve as human beings over time, for example, we become parents. And what we can take in is different than maybe what we could take in 10 years ago when we weren't parents or whenever that was. Do you notice that as we evolve, the things we can or cannot handle can change too?
Yes, absolutely. And there's a couple of mechanisms that are at work there. You're right. Having a child may suddenly make stories about children
It does
way
for me.
harder. Yeah, and it did for I didn't have when I was working in TV, I didn't have kids. So like the kids stories never it wasn't that I didn't care about kids, but I didn't have
Right.
that personal connection. Now I can't even imagine with children having to go out and cover some of the things that I did that involved children and having had a kid. You're absolutely right. So life circumstances can change that expose you to different things that maybe wouldn't have bothered you emotionally before but do now. I did a bunch of studies with folks during COVID, and there was one lady I interviewed who had a real hard time doing stories about people trying to go see their parents in nursing homes because she herself had just right before the pandemic hit, just a few months before, had to put her mother in a nursing home. And so
Yes.
she was experiencing that sort of same inability to see her mom. And those stories she ended up, saying, I can't do it. I'm not going to cover. It's just not, there's no way because of that personal experience. And she just couldn't process it. So things can change within our lives. There's also our own, like what we bring to the table when we become a journalist, our own personal experiences from our past, growing up, how we grew up, who we grew up with, any trauma that we may have experienced as children. All of that comes to the table when you are a journalist, and that's going to impact either positively or negatively your ability to kind of cope with and be resilient in the face of trauma on the job.
Yeah, and we will get into tips and things that we can do. But before we do, is there any other research that you really learned while covering this?
I think that one of the things that has continued to pop up and I think is probably a really great place to start in terms of trying to help journalists understand trauma is newsroom culture. So repeatedly in this research, and I've been doing it for a number of years now, is comes out the idea that I as a journalist can't talk about it. You can't talk about it. There's no way I could go to my supervisor and say I can't cover the story. There's no way I could tell my reporting buddy that I did this. There's that culture of competitiveness even within your own newsroom that prevents that journalist from voicing their concerns. And that is repeatedly unprompted every time I do a study, every time I talk to a journalist and I ask, who did you talk to anybody? No, 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 no. And did they, you said you didn't think you could handle one more moment talking to this person. Well, did you tell your news director? No, 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 no. So the culture is an issue. And if we can get that to change and to even just start to make it okay to start to admit that maybe you're having some emotional difficulties with a story that you covered, to make that okay, I think that that will go a long way to helping journalists stay in the business and cope with some of the trauma that they do experience, because nobody else is going to understand what a journalist goes through but another journalist. So if those other journalists are willing to commiserate and share and normalize that this is part of the job, that could really go a long way to help.
Yeah, I'm in a couple news Facebook groups, and someone will mention something, and it's a bunch of me too, me too, me too, me too, me too. And it's like, it feels like this little community of, oh yeah, we're all dealing with the same things.
Yep. Yeah, and it would be great if that could be something that not only on the little Facebook groups, but that could just be something that gets talked about. It's part
Yeah.
of the job. This is how it rolls. And, just like with a first responder, the police, the fire, it's kind of everybody knows that this is going to be a part of the job. And here are the mechanisms in place to deal with it. It'd be great if journalism could evolve in that way.
But you're right. And I'm not speaking for any station in particular, but you're right. You saying, I don't want to cover this story. I don't feel comfortable. This is bringing some stress to me that I don't want. can make you feel like, oh, I'm just going to come off weak. My bosses aren't going to like me. They're going to think I can't handle it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. And especially for like a young journalist, like you think of a newbie who just is raring to go, ready to rock. And it's like, man, I just covered that story. It's been a couple days and I'm really not feeling myself as a result of it. They're not going to go, if they look around and they see no one else even remotely acknowledging that that's a possibility, they're not going to go and say, hey, what should I do with this? So yeah, there's too much fear of being looked at as someone who can't handle the job to be able to step up and say, hey, I don't think I can do this, or I don't want
Yeah.
to do this because it's not going to be good for me right now.
Yeah. So we can look at tips before, during, and after being a journalist. Let's start with before. Before, and this means aspiring journalists, women that want to get into this industry. What tips would you have for aspiring journalists getting into a field like this?
A couple things. The biggest thing with something like resilience to trauma, hands down, the first thing is awareness. If you know that the job can cause some psychological trauma to you, if you know that that's a possibility, that's like step one to being able to be resilient in the face of it, because you know that it's a possibility. So researching, understanding if a journalist training program, like your school, wherever you're going to get your journalism training, if there isn't any discussion of trauma, and unfortunately there usually isn't, we can we can go down that road too if you want.
Yeah.
But if there isn't a discussion of trauma or any training on it, educating yourself in what is something like traumatic stress and what are some of those symptoms, what could cause it, looking up sources, good sources, is a great way to educate yourself, because again, the awareness can go a long way to building resilience in the face of it and helping you. It's not going to mean you don't maybe have some effects of those stories, but it's going to help you bounce back from those by
Yeah.
knowing that it's a possibility and being able to recognize it. So if there's someone out there who's thinking journalism is for me, it's important to understand that this is part of what can happen as a
Yeah.
part of the job. And the more you understand it and know that it's out there, the better you will be if it occurs.
For sure. I think it's also important to look at the newsroom that you might end up going to. And I know it's easier said than done, but trying to get that gut feeling of whether your bosses, your managers take stock in that. And I know that can be hard when you're just doing a couple interviews, but sometimes it's really trying to get that gut reaction or gut feeling, right?
Absolutely. And there are some fantastic newsrooms out there. There really are. There are some amazing newsroom leaders who get it and want to take care of their staff, because they understand that they are going to have better journalism if they're taking care of their journalists. So
Yes.
there's a lot of newsrooms out there, but there are some that aren't. And you make a great point. Asking, trying to get the vibe, trying to get a feeling for what am I walking into, and is it a I don't want to say loving space, but you know what I mean? Is it
Yeah.
a place for camaraderie and a place for support? And we're all in this together, so let's figure it out. If you get that sort of vibe, that's going to help too. You don't want to walk into a place where they are going to tell you that you just got to suck it up. You want to be in a place where there's at least going to be some acknowledgement and some care.
Yeah, or a station that wants you to do your own live shots by yourself in the middle of the night in a big city.
Exactly. Yes, I would probably do a hard pass on that particular place. And I'll tell my students things like that, like ask these questions, because hard pass, there is no way.
Now, women that are working in journalism, they are in a newsroom, they do cover these stories daily. What advice do you have there?
It's important to know that studies show that women are far more likely to suffer from symptoms of traumatic stress on the job than men. And a lot of that has to do with lifestyle factors, such as, they have the main caregivers of the children. They have, a lot of the house burden on top of doing this type of work. But women are also more likely to be willing to say something about it. So that's kind of a cool change, because once upon a time, women would be the ones who didn't want to appear weak, but more and more we're seeing that women journalists are actually being more willing to step up and speak out and say, hey, this is not working for me. But knowing that as a female journalist, you're already tend to be more susceptible to symptoms of traumatic stress. That's a key. The other thing is, I hesitate to say it this way because I feel like a guru, self-care. Self-care is actually really important. So understanding,
Yes.
how do you cope? What are the things that you like to do that allow you to completely disconnect from stress? What are the things that relax you? And being willing to do those things. And whether that be exercise and carving out the time to exercise, every day, whether that's reading, or maybe it's art, maybe it's being with your friends, your journalist friends or your non-journalist friends, or maybe it's making sure that you play with your kids every night. Something there, you want to be aware as a journalist and as a female journalist, what things can you do for yourself that allow you to clear your head, allow you to feel safe, allow you to emotionally unpack the day. Who are your people that you can talk to, whether that be a husband or a bestie or whatever. What is it that you need to do? And then make sure that you prioritize that. And I got 2 kids, so I hear all the people going, there's no time. But it's important, if you understand that the job can take its toll on you. The first line of defense is very healthy coping mechanisms that allow you to exercise some of that stress. And again, that's going to help you be able to bounce back when that stress mounts, even more than just sort of regular daily news stress, for sure.
Yes, but it's so important to set boundaries, because if you don't, you could go to work for that 8 to 10 hour shift, come home, and your phone is still there, and you just mindlessly decide to open it up and scroll for a few minutes, and you see a news story, and then you start digging in more, and then you're like, wait, what am I doing? I need to put this away so I can't even see it. And that's what I do personally. I say at 7 p.m., my phone is going away. I've covered this all day long. And the next morning at 8 a.m., I can open it back up about an hour before I start work. And I know this isn't always, possible for everyone, but even just some time away from the phone, some time away from the news, I think could be a good idea.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the boundaries are so important, and being willing to, like you said, put it down, and know that if the world explodes and some massive event happens, you'll know, and you'll jump to when you need to. But
Yes.
at the end of the day, there's nothing on a normal news day. There's nothing that's going to happen that the people who are there can't handle
Yeah.
without you, right? So
Yeah.
you don't need to be there, and you don't
Yeah.
need to keep tabs on it until you're ready to the next morning, like you
Yeah.
said, 8 a.m. or whatever that be.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I can't remember who I was interviewing, but they also recommended when you're at work, you're fully at work. But when you're at home, you're fully at home. And I've tried to take stock in that too, that I have to, I do put all my efforts into work when I'm there. I'm invested in the stories. I'm invested in what I'm doing. But when I am at home, I'm focused on my kids. I'm focused on making dinner. I'm focused on those things that are also equally important, or even more so important. And then I honestly feel more refreshed the next day when I go into my job needing to put those priorities on the job itself.
Yeah, absolutely. You just have to be able to sort of to separate that, because journalism is a stressful job. Even on a normal day, journalism is a stressful job. Television journalism, deadlines, boom, 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 go, 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 do all the things, do the socials too. Oh, by the way, you have a VOSAD and a package and a this and a that, and do
Yeah.
all the things and edit it because we need you to.
And do that twice in a day.
And do that twice. Yeah, do that twice each day. The job is stressful anyway. So if you make sure that you are setting those boundaries, like you are saying, and leaving the work at work, that way you're not also kind of already, beaten down. So
Yeah.
when the real exposure to trauma comes, you're already kind of like your trauma immune system, if you will, is already kind of beaten down because of all the sort of daily work stress that you haven't been able to kind of separate from. So it just leaves you open to even more trauma when those big potentially traumatic things happen. So if you
Yeah.
can minimize that sort of daily journalism news stress that comes with deadlines and juggling multiple stories and demands and all of that, the more you can kind of get that under control to the best of your ability on a daily basis, that also is going to help insulate you when that really big, terrible story does come down the pipe and
Yeah.
it's you that has to go there.
Well, and I've also spoken with journalists who have left the industry. And after leaving the industry, they realize how much stress they put on themselves when they were in the industry, but they didn't even realize it until they left.
And that's kind of one of my goals with this research and, things like coming on to this podcast is I think that there are so many journalists who leave, good journalists who leave the business for these reasons because of undiagnosed or unhelped stress, traumatic stress and stress reactions that if they had known and if they had known what to do and had been able to help mitigate those symptoms, they would not have quit. And, we need good journalists. And I hate the fact that I know that we lose incredibly good journalists to things like traumatic stress 99% of the time because they didn't know that's what it was.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm, like awareness is key. If we can tell people that this is a thing, maybe it doesn't have to force them to leave the business
Yeah.
when maybe they didn't really want to, but they just couldn't, deal with all of those symptoms.
Yeah. So, what do you think some of those early warning signs are that they might be starting to experience some trauma or some burnout?
Absolutely. A lot of the it's so funny, it's sort of like normal life things, but what you're looking for are when things are different from your baseline. So if you are a lot more tired than you usually are, and not for like a day. I mean, everybody has everybody has a couple days, where they're just like beat. But if you notice that your fatigue level is beyond what it normally is, and that's lingering, if you start to lose interest in things that normally make you happy. So if you normally like to exercise and you can't drag your butt to the gym, if you normally like to read and you just can't focus, if you normally enjoy your work, but then you go there and you're like, I just got to get out of here. That's another early warning symptom. So that lack of motivation, that lack of being interested in things, trouble sleeping or sleeping too much, dreaming, having, really disturbing dreams, especially ones associated with stories that you're covering. So if they are starting to kind of invade your sleep, that's a key, an indication. Even being, and this one can be hard for women, when you overwhelm easily. So if you notice that you normally can take this much stress in terms of being able to juggle life and juggle work and juggle the things, but all of a sudden you can't, or you've noticed over time your tolerance and your ability to juggle is just not there anymore, that's another indicating factor. Your emotions wildly swinging in one direction or the other, quick to anger, quick to sadden. Those are all things that when they are happening over an extended period of time are red flags. Little pockets, kind of normal, could be a lot of things. But when you notice these types of things developing and they're not going away, that is an indicator that something is happening. And if you've been exposed to a potentially traumatic story, or you've had a run of them, or you can kind of sort of pinpoint some things that you remember kind of bothering you, that might be an indication that it is your exposure to trauma that's starting to cause something like this. And the other thing to remember is sometimes these things can pop up later. So you could cover a story a couple weeks ago, maybe last month, but then all of a sudden the symptoms are coming. So it doesn't have to be immediate. So that's kind of an important kind of little thing to remember, is that if you're feeling this way and you're like, but I haven't covered a story like this since last month, it could be that one from last month. Sometimes the symptoms are not automatic. They after you kind of get out of the stress of it and move away from it, then they start to develop.
Interesting. Are there any tips for women that are on a daily story? They go out in the field, they have to cover a story. Any tips that you have for a woman to think about when they are out in the field conducting something so that maybe they don't have or don't develop these symptoms during the day?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things to remember that journalists are pretty good at in the moment sort of putting up that wall, like we said. Journalists are very good at compartmentalizing. And I think it's a skill that serves a journalist well in a number of ways.
Yeah.
So I would never say, don't compartmentalize, just feel it all and let your emotions run wild. That's counterproductive, and it's not going to allow you to do the job that you have to do, especially in the moment of something breaking, in the moment of a big story. So in that moment, I think it is okay to compartmentalize and put up that wall as you need to. But at the same time, if you are in a situation, perhaps when you're interviewing a victim and you're feeling empathetic towards that person, allow that empathy to flow freely. You are a human being, and you can be a human being and a journalist at the same time. And women are naturally more empathetic, tend to be more willing to show empathy. So women journalists should not be afraid to do so when it fits. And
Yeah.
I would say if you're talking to someone who's been through something terrible, being empathetic and sharing empathy with them is not only good for you, but it's good for them, because studies of victims who have interacted with journalists, they appreciate that, and that helps them
Yes.
and actually keeps the journalist from risking causing them harm during that interview. So don't be afraid to be empathetic and show the level of emotion that's appropriate for that situation. And again, not every situation is going to be the right time, but if you can be human and be a good journalist at the same time. So it's important to remember that not all situations are the same, and there will be times when empathy and caring are completely fine as part of journalistic work, and other times where maybe you shouldn't do that. And
Right.
most journalists probably are able to tell the difference.
Yeah.
But then after that story, if you did have to sort of compartmentalize and keep your emotions in check, it's always important to find a way to let those flow later. And again, there's any number of ways that can happen, but it should happen, and it's important to let it happen because that will make you more resilient.
Yeah. Don't let it just get all bottled up.
It's the worst possible thing that you can do. If shouting at your steering wheel is the best that you can do, do it, because you're far better off. Yeah.
I also know journalists who listen to true crime podcasts after after they've worked a full news day. Like, that's their pleasure. I can't imagine that that's great either.
Well, it's interesting. As an avid true crime podcast listener myself, sometimes that can actually be cathartic too, because I guess on the face of it, it seems like it would be counterproductive. Like, you
Yeah.
just covered all this crime, and then you go and you start to listen to this crime, but you're no longer, as a journalist, the one that's covering it.
Yeah.
You're just consuming it as an enjoyer of it, as a viewer of it. You're kind of on the other side of it.
Yeah.
And sometimes even that, you're removing yourself from it, and then it becomes something that's enjoyable and relaxing. And because crime may still be of interest to you,
Yeah.
but when you're no longer having to report it and immerse yourself in it, you're just hearing and listening and kind of being that just
Interesting.
receiver of it. It can actually be really relaxing. So
Yeah.
so go for it, have at it if that's if that's what you enjoy, for sure.
My colleague Kathy will love that information because she's like, ask about true crime podcasts and how if that's affecting me at all.
Not necessarily. No, absolutely.
I'm not going to tell her, though. I'm going to tell her she has to listen to this podcast in order to get that
To
information.
find out. Yeah.
So we talked about aspiring journalists. We talked about journalists in the field. Now let's talk about, as you were just saying, those that maybe have been in the business a while. They've maybe been exposed to trauma for years, decades maybe, or those that recently just got out of the business. What tips would you have for those two categories?
I think it's especially important if you have been in the business for a long time or you've just recently left it and you really do feel as though you're experiencing symptoms of traumatic stress, seeking professional help is the way to go. And I think it's helpful that there's less stigma about going to see, for example, a counselor and that sort of thing. Seeking professional help and finding that person who you connect well with in terms of a therapist or a mental health specialist, that's the person that you need to see, because sometimes you can have these traumatic stress symptoms, and if you cope well and you're resilient, they can go away and you can kind of bounce back. But if you don't, they can continue to impact your daily life. And it's not just your ability to be a journalist, it's your life. So they're impacting your interactions with your family, with your friends, they're impacting your ability to just kind of do your daily life. That's when, despite any misgivings you may have, seeking someone professional to help you work through and decide what's going on and the best practice for figuring that out, that's what you really need to do. And that's how you're going to get the help that you need, for sure.
I would bet that so many journalists let trauma go untreated after a long time in the business or leaving the business, because we are strong individuals, but we kind of just brush it off a lot of times. Do you notice that?
Yeah, and I think it's the sort of the curse of the idea that we're not the story, right? So we have to, as a journalist, separate ourselves from what we're seeing so that we can tell a straightforward, factual, objective story. But that wall, it's not really a wall. We're still getting the impact of that, and we're just compartmentalizing those reactions, and they're, we're sort of stuffing them away into that little compartment, if you will. But that compartment is not endless, and it's going to leak. And after a while, all of those emotions that you've kind of stuffed away because the job requires that you do so, without dealing with those, letting them out, venting, doing, the coping mechanisms that are necessary, they are going to come back to bite you. And I think there's a lot of journalists that don't understand that that's what it is, and they can't figure out why they changed and why journalism changed them and how it changed them. But it's that little bucket of repressed stuff and compartmentalized stuff that was never dealt with.
Yeah, I've talked about this on a podcast previously about how when I report, I sometimes will try to compartmentalize and not and try to separate it. But then I'll start feeling guilty for trying to separate it. It's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it really is. And, it's such you want to, emotion in journalism is such a tricky little path, because obviously you want to be compassionate and empathetic where that is necessary. And you want to be able to connect with the people that you're interviewing, and you want to tell their story well. But at the same time, you have to find some way to protect yourself and not get too caught up in it. And yeah, it's just such then you feel guilty. Like if you're not feeling bad when maybe you should be feeling, if I was a human, I would feel bad.
I'm not being empathetic enough. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So you get tangled up in all of this, and actually that causes problems too, because, that guilt can really weigh on you. And so, yeah, it's a real, journalism and emotion are a real sort of tangled little dance. But I think the important thing to remember is, if you're going to go and you're going to do that story and you've kept yourself from crying, for example, as you've heard this story from, from someone, and you've interviewed them and you've been exposed to all of this, go home and let it out. If you're not going to let it out at the story, which may or may not be the most appropriate place, if you don't have a newsroom where you could go home and let it out in the newsroom, go home and let it out. Let out those emotions, and whether that's just venting to your steering wheel or to a loved one, someone who is a safe place to listen, get it out. If you're repressing it because the job requires, don't keep it locked away. Get it out of there eventually.
Well, you make another great point, talking to your steering wheel, because honestly, there can be issues. I mean, as journalists, people sometimes think because we're silent, we're not talking about issues, that we might not have any opinion on anything, because we're supposed to be unbiased and not have an opinion and let the story speak for itself. But in that silence, we can also feel like man, I can't voice my opinion. I can't say this out loud. I really want to speak my truth, but at the end of the day, we can't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does, and it sucks, for lack of a better way to put it, because there is so much value in being able to speak your mind and being able to share those opinions and vent your emotions, good, bad, all of them. So yeah, it does suck, and it's doesn't help when that journalist is feeling like, well, I have all this stuff, but I'm not allowed to say anything. And, I'm
Right.
angry about the state of this and I'm angry about the state of that, but I can't share that.
Yeah.
You need to be able to share it. And, just because you can't share it on the air and maybe can't share it in your newsroom doesn't mean you can't share it to trusted others, because no one wants to feel locked up, and locking up emotions is not helpful.
Yes.
But
My
yeah.
husband gets an earful.
Yeah. Which is fantastic that he listens, because, that's what you need. You need to be able to, just sort of spew sometimes, because we are, as a journalist, just kind of not supposed to. And, these days there's a lot that a journalist might really want to sound off about.
Yes. Well, I heard someone recently suggest that they try to get louder in speaking the facts on air, as loud as possible, speaking the facts so that people can form their own opinion. It's still tough, though, but I try to think about that.
Yeah. I mean, there's, as if journalists don't have enough to worry about, the climate, the political climate and the backlash and the misinformation. It's just sort of an added layer of frustration that is not doing anybody any good, especially from a journalistic standpoint, because I believe that the vast majority of journalists got into it because they wanted to speak truth to power and tell the stories and tell people what's going on in the world. And to be kind of discounted for that is just unnecessary and adds to that, level of trauma and just trying to figure out how to navigate the situation. And none of that is good.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago, there was a couple big weekend news stories. One of those was the protests in Minneapolis, and I had friends that were in the field on the ground in Minneapolis, and I was looking through the comments, and I mean, they were just getting crucified no matter what they did. It didn't matter what they did. They were going to get crucified by some people of the public. I also was watching the weather, and we had historic weather. We had freezing temperatures, but still, there were people in the comments saying, meteorologists, the job where you can be wrong 100% of the time and still have a job. Ha 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 ha. Haven't heard that one before. Like, it's almost like you're always going to have the public. There's always going to be people that are going to criticize what you do. But that's unique for a job like journalism, where you're in the public eye, and no matter what you do, there's going to be people that don't like you, that complain how you do it, et cetera, et cetera. That can also be stressful.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And especially for women, there's a lot of studies coming out now about online harassment and harassment, physical harassment in the field, especially at things like protests where there's a lot of people. And yeah, it's now we're talking physical safety, because a lot of times that harassment
Yeah.
can include like threats or that sort of thing. And it can be very bad. There's a lot of studies coming out about the stress that associated with that and how that's adding to the trauma from a newsroom. Because now, yeah, I am kind of scared. I don't know if I go out to this protest, am I going to get beat up? Am I going to get screamed at, yelled at, had stuff thrown at me? Am I going to get arrested? Am I going to, so you throw all that in there, and it's not great. And it's funny because I think that, back when I was reporting, there wasn't as much of an online presence, because it's been a minute since I've been in the field. And that it was great, because unless someone really called or, posted something on the website, there wasn't as much give and take with the daily public as there is now. And I don't know that that's great all the time. I don't know that giving people just sort of an open blank check to be able to say whatever the heck they think about you, your physical appearance, how you've reported, all of that, I don't know that that's great, nor is it necessary. And it is. It's really adding to trauma and to, journalists' difficulty in just trying to do their job.
When we look at the future of journalism, is there anything that you notice, any shifts that you notice happening when it comes to stress and trauma?
I will say that I think that there has been small but noticeable shifts in the recognition of it. So when
Good.
I said that there are good newsrooms out there, once upon a time there weren't, and there are now. And
Yeah.
especially in cases where there's like a mass shooting or some big event that local stations have to cover, local newsrooms have to cover, those newsrooms are being more proactive in trying to offer help for their journalists to varying degrees, but at least they're willing to say, hey, this might have been rough for you. Here's some resources, or here's counseling, or here's any number of things that they're trying to offer. So I will say that there has begun to be a shift in terms of newsrooms and other people within the industry being willing to kind of acknowledge the mental and psychological
Yeah.
toll that journalism takes. So I think that that's promising. It's kind of like, turning the Titanic, right? Like it's not a fast turn, but it's nice that the conversation is now starting to happen, and hopefully that's something that just continues to grow and becomes, again, sort of normalized.
Yeah.
So that's one trend, at least from the areas that I research, that I'm starting to see. It doesn't help in terms of the other stressors of like no pay and people getting laid off, and those sort of industry factors that the journalists themselves and honestly newsroom managers can't really help. Those don't help. Those add to the existing problems, and one can only hope that those things also begin to shift.
Yeah.
But at the very least, from the areas that I research, there's starting to be more talk and more acceptance of it, which I think is positive.
Yeah, I've spoken with a few veteran TV journalists who said, the ones that have been in the business 20, 30 years, and they said it was not talked about back then.
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, any of your old school folks who've been around for a long time, even the little bit of talk that happens now is way more than there was ever
Yeah.
happening, a couple decades ago in newsrooms, and even honestly, even a decade ago. So it's becoming something that people are maybe willing to talk about more, and I think that is a good thing, especially, unfortunately, because I think we're not gonna not continue to have these sort of big events that are potentially traumatic, whether that's going to be a mass shooting or a big protest, that like the stuff in Minneapolis that ends in the death of a civilian. Those things aren't going away, and journalists are just going to have to be there covering those things. So the more we can kind of talk about the trauma associated with that, the better off we'll be.
And now there's social media, which back then, 20, 30 years ago, when you went to job to report, to do the news, you came home and the only news you got was if the television was on. Now that's not the case anymore.
Yeah. And this, I always say this, and I feel like this makes me sound like a old fuddy-duddy, but I am no fan of social media. I'm on it. I do the thing. And I think that there are positive attributes to it, but there's so much of that overexposure that I don't know is great. Overexposure to news, overexposure to the ability to just sort of randomly share opinions. It's just a lot that I don't know. People having that much access to that type of stuff in that way, I don't know is great.
Yeah.
And, I think the studies will show that there's far more negatives that come out of something like social media than the positives. And if there was a way to sort of rein it in, so only those positive connective things happened, that would be great. But unfortunately, that cat is out of the bag and it's not going back.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, but I want to talk about your podcast because you're going to be putting out a podcast soon talking about all things like this. Can you explain to our listeners how they can listen and what it's about?
Yeah, I really welcome the opportunity to share the info. I am starting a podcast. It's called Informed Reporting is the name of the podcast. And what I'm looking at focusing on is trying to connect working journalists with the academic research that we know exists about them, because working journalists are not reading academic articles. They're just not.
Yes.
But there's such a wealth of information out there about the journalist experience, trauma, stress, and all of it that is there for the picking, and for journalists to really to be able to learn from. So my idea with the podcast is to connect them to that. I'm going to be bringing on academic researchers talking about the things that they've found and turning that into actionable things that journalists who are working now can do. I'm hoping to bring on working journalists, the ones that are willing to talk about their experiences, and really just kind of create it as a place for conversation about what it is to be a journalist today, and how it can sometimes be really hard, and how can we learn to be resilient in the face of that.
Yeah.
So it's called Informed Reporting. I am going to launch this spring. There'll be an Instagram. It's called Informed Reporting Podcast on Instagram. I am Dr. Gretchen Hoak on Instagram. So I will start to post things there as I get closer to the launch. But if any of your listeners hear about this and they want to reach out and are interested, I have a informed reporting podcast at gmail.com email. So they can also just email that, and that would come directly to me, and we can have a conversation. And so that's kind of basically the idea behind it, just trying to bring what we know to the people who need it most.
Well, I can't wait to listen. Gretchen, thank you for your time. Is there any last takeaways that you want to leave our viewers with before I let you go?
I think just that, as a journalist and as female journalists, I still believe that journalism is a fantastic career, and it's necessary, and it's an important part of what our country is. And I hope that journalists are willing to learn about the possible negatives of, what the work can do, so that they can stay. Because I think that there are so many fantastic storytellers out there who don't need to suffer from the work that they do. And the more that they're willing to learn and talk and share, the better off everyone can be.